Welcome to Be the Wellness Podcast, where we help you master your body, mind, and the experience of life through insightful conversation, interviews with experts and thought leaders, all with a side of marital banter and some good old-fashioned humor.
Yes, we are your hosts, Adam and Vanessa Lambert, and we're committed to helping you live life fully expressed physically, mentally, and experientially. Sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and join the conversation.
Hello and welcome everybody to Be the Wellness Podcast. Adam and Vanessa Lambert here with a doozy of a podcast.
Absolutely. Get ready to take notes.
Yes, absolutely. Dr. Alan Christianson has brought the thunder.
Yes, absolutely. Dropping knowledge bombs left and right.
Yeah. So while you go get your notepad, let us take an opportunity to talk to you about Montana.
Yes, we're so excited about Montana because it's the last best place.
It is the last best place. You know, it's funny. I was going to say exactly the same thing.
Funny. I think the state says the same thing. It's their slogan after all, right?
Yeah. I think so.
I think so too. At least it's on shirts all over when you go there.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. It's like Big Sky Country, right?
Yes.
But also the last best place.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I like all of those.
I mean, it's a big state, so they can have multiple slogans.
And they do have big skies.
Yeah, it's true.
And it's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's actually technically the last best place, but it's pretty darn close to it.
Man, it's right up there.
It really is. When we went there last summer to scout for this retreat, we just felt like we were actually like, can we buy a house here?
Yeah.
Can we live here sometimes?
People should spend more time here.
Yeah, it was really, really special. And the energy, especially around Glacier National Park, which is where our retreat will be based out of, is just really beautiful. It's kind of hard to describe. The only kind of comparison I've ever had was being in the Andes in Peru,
right,
to how I felt being in some of the mountains in specifically in East Glacier, which we'll be spending some time in. And just really like feeling the mountains around you and just getting lost in them is such a wonderful experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's just big country.
It really is. And it just helps you to feel so grounded and so connected. And I was really in awe by Montana. And so we've got some more, a few more spots for both individual females and individual males. Mm-hmm. So if you want to come and join in, grab one of those last few places. And remember, we have a partnership with a firm, so you can pay over time. You can decide on your length of term and, set that up with them so that, payment options are in your hands now.
Yeah.
And it's so exciting for us because now you can select what works for you. You can work it out direct with them. And we're kind of we've exited stage left from being the middleman.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Because I mean, the biggest problem with all of that was like, if people wanted to make payments, they had to be kind of on our timeline.
Right, exactly.
And so now that obstacle is removed.
And you get to be on your timeline.
And you can be on your timeline, which is
way better.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's, we have a hard time sticking to our timeline.
Yeah, exactly. We can only imagine how it is for you folks out there.
Yeah, exactly.
But Montana, we're bringing Chef Joanne and our crew out. So we'll have obviously our paleo meals catered and everything just really high quality and created just for this experience for us. Mm-hmm. We couldn't find a chef in a situation that we wanted to work with there. And so what we do is we bring our people with us.
Yeah, it's true. We don't sacrifice quality.
No.
I mean, we just don't.
Yeah, we just don't.
It's one of the things, especially when it comes to food and sleep.
Yes.
Those are two things that we're just not going to mess around with, And then, technically movement. And we've got Angelo coming. He's going to help us with
coming
that.
with us, it's just going to be a great time. There's some awesome people attending, and it's going to be a really special experience. So if you'd like to join us, hop in. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, come check us out. BeTheWellness.com. Go to Montana and check it out.
And make it happen.
Make it happen.
Yes, absolutely. So moving on, Dr. Alan Christianson. So this was a really amazing podcast. We received his latest book, which is the Metabolism Reset Diet, a couple of, maybe about a month or two ago. We got an advance copy from the publishing house. And, we get a lot of these books that come through and we review them. And as you'll hear me talk about in the podcast, I just basically demolished this book in 2 days.
Yeah.
And I couldn't put it down because it just made so much darn sense.
Right.
And, everyone's talking about the liver these days. It seems like that's kind of, the popular organ to talk about these days, but for good reason.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of function and a lot of things that the liver is in control of, and, or at least facilitating and assisting.
Yeah.
So if it's not working optimally, it's really going to affect a lot of the other systems of the body.
A lot.
Including your metabolism and how you store excess calories or excess energy.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. I think, this is something that I do a tremendous amount of research on and am, pretty tightly connected to, because at the end of the day, we have a lot of clients who are specifically interested in fat loss.
Yes.
And there's, like we talk about all the time, there's the low-hanging fruit of paleo, so to speak, right? It's like go paleo, primal, clear out a lot of these things and, and just watch what happens and see, right? And that's, like we always say, it's magic for some people, but it's not for others. And so discerning like what makes that difference for the individual is something that I spend a lot of time doing. And I'll tell you, man, like what we'll talk about in this podcast, with relation to the liver and how it helps to partition fuel and how all of this stuff works out is it's starting to really show up in a lot of places in the work that I'm doing with our clients. And so I think it's well timed for one, and it's just, man, he does a great job of articulating the information and then kind of making it, approachable and palatable. It's like, okay, so I've got this organ, now what? Like what do I need to do? And it's actually fairly simple.
Yeah,
pretty straightforward.
It is. Yeah. And he gives some great tips. Obviously, the book really dives into a full reset, and that's what, we'll be talking about today. But he also gives some great tips about how to just support the liver, things that, are small changes that you can make to your day-to-day living structure that can help support and, give it a little bit of help, so to speak. Dr. Christianson is a naturopathic physician. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He's been featured on all kinds of media outlets, including NBC Today, Women's World, Dr. Oz, Fox, the Food Network, the whole gamut. This guy's been around and he really knows his stuff. So I hope you guys enjoy this podcast.
Yeah, without a doubt. And also, without further ado, here's Dr. Christianson. And we're live. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Christianson.
Hey, you guys. Thanks so much for having me. I'm super jazzed to be here with you.
Yeah, it's really great to be with you as well. And I've been watching your work over the last few years. So I was excited when we received a copy of the Metabolism Reset Diet and was excited that you were willing to come on and talk about it.
Way cool.
So here's where I want to start. We hear this word or this phrase, metabolic reset, all of the time. Where I really want to kick off with is, what does this mean, metabolic reset? Or what does that mean when you refer to resetting someone's metabolism?
Yeah. So there's a phrase too, metabolic flexibility, that I talk about. And the weird thing is that it takes about 2 years to have a book be written and have it come out. And during those 2 years, I've had this happen before to where I've like coined a phrase or an idea. And then during those interim 2 years, it gets co-opted and used in different ways. So, so now metabolic flexibility often refers to someone that can burn carbs or fats. But when I first talked about that, we never get exactly our fuel requirements on a given day. And a healthy person, that's okay. Their body will harmlessly store moderate extra amounts and not have big consequences from that. And if there's times where you get a little less, also no big consequences. Your body pulls out of stores and keeps your energy going really well. And that's what someone has flexible metabolism, that's what it's like for them. And so to reset that is to take someone to where they're back to that place, to where they don't have to be on a tightrope of exact, counting or tracking just to maintain. Their body's got some leeway built in again.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And it is interesting, this sort of the collective consciousness around terminology, right? People just kind of pull it out of the ethos and assign it to a certain ideal. But I love this idea because I think that so many people right now are really focused on finding that specific diet and those exact macronutrients and those exact calorie, the exact calorie spread to help them meet their goals. But I love this idea of actually having that flexibility where you don't have to be quite as precise.
Well, all your listeners know someone that does like maybe 50% of it right and seems to get good results.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
And I also know someone that does 100% of it right and barely gets decent results. So the trick is not how do you try harder or what's the newest strategy. The trick is how do you shift that percentage and give your body more of its own homeostasis back again.
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Because you're 100% right. I mean, this is something with our coaching clients that we just go through time and time again. And what it ends up looking like a lot of the time is that, it turns out there's a ton of individual variability on what the appropriate diet is, and of course that's going to change over time. And I have a feeling that what you're talking about here may provide some insight into why that is, and then sort of how to normalize it.
So let's start with the liver, because obviously the book is largely focused on repairing the liver. And maybe you can just explain the liver's impact on your metabolism or on this metabolic flexibility.
For sure. And it's basically the last place you've got to store any extra fuel and to manage it. I saw the image of you guys on the site, crazy fit. That's awesome. So,
on a good day.
So you guys have good muscle mass. And I think about your body almost like a series of cascading bowls. There's probably a name for this. Like there's a fountain I've seen in yards to where the top bowl fills the next bowl, and it keeps going down and down. So the first place that fuel that you consume, whether it's fat or carbs or ketones or even alcohol, the first place your body's fuel, which you could use for fuel, where it goes to is your skeletal muscles. And when they're active, when they've got some space, when they're in the game, they can take up a fair amount and soak it up and hold on to that. When they can't take any more, the next bucket is then subcutaneous fat. And that's stuff that's below the skin. It's by and large, it's harmless. It can be a concern as far as just aesthetics, but it's not so much a sign of danger. The bowl past that is then the visceral fat. This is the fat that's around the organs. And this is funny. We used to think this stuff was dangerous. Now we know it's protective. Pretty bizarre. But the more inflamed visceral fat is, the more it's protecting you because it's holding on to fuel from going into the next bucket. And the next bucket is really the liver. And the liver can store fuel inside the cells or between the cells. And when it's healthy, it's got a lot of room inside the cells. And it can store fuel in the form of glycogen or triglyceride. When it's unhealthy, it's gotten so jammed full of fuel inside the cells that there's no room, and it's spilling over to outside the cells. So the trick is, how do you get it to where the liver can be that last place again to take on fuel in a safe way and control it? Because we always need energy for everything we do, but we're only consuming it whenever we eat. And so your body's buckets and finally the liver, that's where we hold on to that, and that's how we manage it.
So all of these things are sort of acting as a capacitor, so to speak, to eat up the excess and then provide a little bit later on. So this sort of end stage that you're talking about, where we're talking about storing fat between the layers, would that be what is considered like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? Is that what we're talking about?
That's exactly it. And the thing that is often lost is that the disease is horribly underdiagnosed, one, but two, it's on a continuum. So body composition, you can think about how lean a healthy person is. Your liver should be even leaner than that. When the liver has 5% fat, it's diseased. That's where we draw the cutoff for non-alcoholic fatty liver. And somewhere around 0.5% is probably healthy, but you could think that 4.9 is not great. So yeah, it's a long continuum.
So maybe you can just sort of clue people into why our livers are taking the brunt of all of this, and why we're seeing, well, obviously you're not seeing enough diagnosis, but I'm sure you're seeing this on the rise, and really what's happening in our environment or, in our food systems that's triggering this rise in this issue.
Yeah. So there's three parts of the equation, and there can be varying combinations of those three parts. I guess the most base level is there's just too much fuel coming in. And I like the word fuel over calorie because, one, I think calorie has a lot of emotional baggage attached to it for many of us, and also a lot of just preconceptions. And then also within the category of things that comprise calories, things like protein or resistant starch, they work a little differently. But on a molecular level, carbs and fats, they're both just carriers of oxaloacetate, and same true for ketones. So many have struggled trying to think, if I swap out diesel for unleaded, will it be okay? And they're all fuel. They're all oxaloacetate. So on one level, there can be just too much fuel coming in. On the other level, the body may not be doing a good job soaking it up. And that's where I was thinking about the picture of you guys in the healthy muscle tissue. You want to have that first bucket ready and waiting to take on some fuel. And then the last part of the mixture is that it's not burning right. There can be the pilot lights off and you're missing some micronutrients, or maybe you spilled your oatmeal boiled over and has the burner all wet. Maybe there's like toxicants or whatever that's slowing down the system or blocking the body's ability to convert oxaloacetate energy. So yeah, too much fuel, not enough ability to utilize fuel, or just not burning it right.
Interesting. So on the, let's kind of unpack these a little bit, because I think the too much fuel piece people are probably pretty familiar with conceptually, but the idea of it not burning correctly or not burning efficiently, and you'd mentioned a lack of or some sort of deficiency in some micronutrients or something. What would that look like? Is there a common sort of subset of micronutrients that we find, the typical person is missing that might be experiencing this?
Yeah, for sure. Some of the big things we can see will include like magnesium, or also we'll see the body's ability to utilize folic acid. That's a funny one because we have to activate folic acid and convert it into methylfolate, and we get dietary folates. A lot of people genetically can't use folic acid. And in that case, it's almost like you need this key to open the lock, and you've got a key that, just came back from the locksmith and it doesn't quite fit. And so not only does it not work, but it breaks off and now the lock is jammed shut. And that's what folic acid can do for many people. And we find that in lots of processed foods and supplements.
Interesting. And so these would be the people that they've got the MTHFR, right? Or they're bad methylators. That's their lot in life.
Yeah. And for some, it's just the MTHFR issue. There's a lot of other genes that are responsible for that. And also a lot of situations that can impinge upon methylation that are not even genetic. But yeah, for a big chunk of people, folic acid is toxic stuff for them.
So obviously we're talking a little bit about the liver and the function that it plays in all of this, but I'm trying to think of the kind of person who would be listening to this conversation. What would be some of the signs or symptoms that they'd be experiencing that would indicate that it might be good to do something like a metabolic reset, or something to help, recondition their liver, so to speak?
In terms of signs or symptoms, there's a lot of things that are more specific or more medical. Like we'll see tendencies towards back of the head, occipital headaches, or we can see big tendencies for blood sugar drops between meals. But the most simple level, I think about three main things people are considering with their health. Their energy levels, their waist size, and their appetite. And when your liver's working great, all three of those just fall into place. All three of those are pretty much where you'd want them to be. But when your liver's off, it's almost like if you manage one or two of them, you're pushing the other one where you don't want it. If you're struggling enough to lower your food intake to where you're making a change in your waist, well, then your energy tanks and maybe your appetite's out of control. Or if you're eating clean food and being more intuitive about the amounts and not stressing about it, then maybe you can really dial in your energy and control your appetite, but it may not affect the change you want on the waist or the size. So that's the main thing. If those three things don't want to sync up, then that's when you think about this.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of the person out there who's thinking, but I don't drink. Why would my liver be deconditioned or not working optimally? What are some of the things that affect the liver besides just the obviously low-hanging fruit like alcohol and toxins? What are some of the things that people may not realize are really influencing the health of their liver?
Well, so I talked a little bit about the types of levels of like fat or storage in the body. There's one called organ fat, and that's way more toxic than the visceral fat. It's the stuff that builds up between the liver cells, and it's the largest driver of inflammation. So even like a couple grams of fat that have built up in the liver from fuel overload, that can drive any chronic inflammatory symptom you can imagine. arthritis or autoimmune disease or immune susceptibility to chronic infections. So these things do that. There's toxins called adipokines that are released from these cells in the liver, and it doesn't take huge amounts of damage. So the fatty liver thing, for example, we know that if you look at people closely and just do even the most basic tests, we see that 30 to 40% of adults have it. But if you do the most exhaustive tests, what you see is that if you take people that have no signs of liver disease because of their blood markers or because of their even a clear ultrasound, but if you just biopsy people that have no symptoms and no issues, 38% still have fatty liver disease. So it's crazy prevalent. And it's not always just one thing, as it is the sum total of modern life. Like you mentioned, the toxins we're exposed to, just how we're using our fuel overall, and the stress of life on it.
Absolutely. So if someone out there is, well, actually, first let's get to the actual reset, the nuts and bolts of what it means to undertake this actual reset diet. Maybe you can just explain what that means for folks and what that looks like on the court.
This came about, there was a 2011 study that was done for type 2 diabetes. And it was the first time they showed that it was reversible, like at a molecular level by CT scan in the pancreas, you could see it reverse. And the study it was pretty rigid. They did 600 calorie a day diets, and it was liquid only. And it was not the kind of stuff you guys would put in your shakes, I guarantee. Corn syrup solids and corn oil and stuff. It was like crap ingredients. But it reversed the diabetes and changed these people's lives. So I saw that, and, thinking like you all do about good foods, I thought, what if we did real foods and maybe a little more of that? And I've seen a lot of data too about just the simplicity of meal replacement and like fewer moving parts for people and less decision fatigue. So we did a modified version of that and did a higher caloric load and more with real foods, and saw it radically effective for reversing diabetes. And then we started translating this and seeing how much this tied into liver function. And the first iteration was people were saying that they're always, it's funny, they're always happy about not being diabetic and not needing medications, but they were crazy happy that they were down 3 dress sizes.
Right. And more importantly, how do I look?
Seriously, yeah.
Yeah.
And so we realized that the dropping of the dress sizes, the waist reduction correlated with changes in liver function. And then we kept making this more specific to improve liver health. And as we were doing that, there was more research coming out saying that, hey, the liver's the big player in diabetes. It's not even the pancreas. Funny thing, but we think about how the blood sugar elevates after a meal. And the old idea is that if someone had metabolic compromise, if they were pre-diabetic, if they ate carbs, their blood sugar would spike and their insulin would drive it wherever, and they couldn't control it, and they had high blood sugar. And that's how we used to think about it. But newer studies have showed that you can differentiate the glucose that your liver makes from the glucose that you absorb from your diet. And those who are metabolically compromised, 85% of their glucose after meal isn't from their diet. It's what their body's liver released. So yeah, we kept on tweaking this to make it more liver specific. And we built it around doing a shake for breakfast and lunch and a pretty good meal in the evening, and then some ideas for snacks as need be between times.
Interesting. So as a whole, in the way that this is done, like where would you find it landing on a calorie perspective, or on an energy density perspective? Is it arguably lower than, sort of normal, or kind of right in there, and you're not relying so much on the actual energy component as the constituents of the diet?
Yeah, so to go deeper, great questions. It does end up being negative energy balance for most people. And so a couple of thoughts around that. We wanted there to be still a maintenance amount of protein. So there's more sparing of muscle mass and less loss of muscle mass. I did also work in a few micro workouts to keep the muscles engaged and active, but I do encourage not doing long, strenuous workouts just during this time window. Many people that train really hard and cut back a lot in their food intake, they create a big stress load in their systems. And, they don't feel well, they're not sleeping, and they're probably going to lose a lot of muscle mass and maybe rebound along the way. So during this brief window of time, I encourage less intense activity, enough to keep the muscles engaged so that the fuel deficit doesn't translate into muscle loss.
Awesome. So, let's talk about the length and sort of the cadence of the diet. It's 4 weeks, correct? From start to finish is really the recommended
Correct.
time frame. Is there
Yep.
something that folks can do sort of as a precursor to the diet? So they know they want to do it. Maybe they want to start in 6 weeks or whatever. Is there something that they can do from when they decide to do it till they actually start?
Some simple things in terms of just preparation, nothing that takes just as far as just like planning for food and shopping and, getting loved ones on board and with expectations
Yeah.
and stuff.
Right.
But beyond that, yeah, we use this so much in the clinic with people that we would just start them on straight away. Like with
Hmm.
someone who were diabetic, we would just have them start like the following day and, stop medication, start the diet, and 6 weeks out, check them again, see them non-diabetic. So people can just step into it without there being a lot of physical preparation per se.
Mm, awesome. And what about once you've completed the diet and you're feeling like you've received this reset, so to speak? What are the things that you can do to maintain it or maybe even enhance it after you've gone through the process?
That's an awesome question. And uh, I talk a lot about maintenance ideas in the book, and it's honestly, I I do give some good outlines, but the thing that lights me up the most in terms of the feedback we hear, because we've had tens of thousands of people go through this, the thing that excites me the most is when someone says, "Hey, I did this 6 months ago, and I'm great. I'm doing more or less the things I did before I did the reset, and it's working better for me. I'm maintaining
Mm,
my weight. Maybe I'm still dropping a few pounds gradually, but my body's working differently." So that's the part that I like the most. My my I don't know. My intuitive sense is that most people that listen to health experts like yourselves, they're smarter than the average consumer, and they know a lot of good things too. They're probably doing a lot of the good things already. So
mm.
Right.
it's just so exciting when they can get more results from the efforts they're already putting in.
Right. It just sort of removes a barrier that was, difficult to see. It's
Yeah.
something going on there that you're just like, man, I just can't get past this plateau or this, you know, uh, the standard sort of fat loss vernacular is, man, everything was working and then it stopped.
Yep.
And you're like, all right, well, what's going on here? And so kind of to that end, there's been some talk, especially in and around kind of the keto crowd and people who have been utilizing that. I don't know that keto defines one diet anymore, but it somewhere in that super low carb realm to experience some fat loss. And something that's come up is sort of this phase 2 liver detox
Yeah.
that is something that can help with continuing the process or help with supporting your liver through these times of somewhat dramatic fat loss at times. And I'm wondering what your thoughts on that are, and if this reset sort of could in fact fulfill that obligation for folks, or are we kind of talking about two different things?
No, no, dude, you're spot on. So one of my goals in this, in the past, I would do a lot of testing of those liver pathways in people. It is measurable through some challenge tests, phase one, phase two, the subtypes, the conjugation pathways. But I saw many common patterns, and yeah, there's often times in which the phase one. So phase one is kind of like where you're loosening up the junk you want to get out, and then phase two is where you're safely packaging it. I thought about this like mining. Like phase one is the little guys with the picks and the wall breaking out the rocks. And then
Right.
phase two is putting the rocks in the carts and hauling them away.
Mm,
And
Hmm.
and yeah, it's easier. There's more things that are called phase one inducers. It's a long list, and it's easy to really ramp up your body's breakdown and mobilization of wastes. But it's really common that phase two does not keep up. And in those cases, we
mm,
call that pathologic detoxification or retoxification. Things are being made into more dangerous secondary chemical metabolites. They're being redistributed to more delicate parts of the body. So that's a big issue. And in terms of the foods that I chose, and also the supplying of certain essential amino acids, that was a real big strategy in how the diet was set up. There's a category of vegetables called Apiaceae that you don't hear about as much, but that includes parsnips and parsley and carrots and a few others. And those are really good phase two inducers. So I did rely heavily upon those. There's also a lot of benefit with resistant starch for regulation of phase two relative to phase one. So I included quite a bit of that in that regime.
interesting. So how does that? So in maybe my understanding of resistant starch isn't deep enough for that to be obvious. But I mean, fundamentally, the way that I understand resistant starch is that, the process. I mean, so take like white rice or parboiled rice, for example. You cook it and then you cool it, and then once that modifies the starch to some degree, and then that consuming that sort of starch has a generally slower glycemic load or insulin response or anything like that goes along with it. But is there something deeper in the resistance of it?
All those things are completely correct. There's 6 categories of resistant starch. They're RS1 through 6, and 4 through 6 are all synthesized. They're not found in foods. 1 is found in seeds, in the coating of seeds, and it's not really metabolically useful. So 2 is found innately in a fair amount of foods, especially potatoes and bananas and plantains, and then legumes of all types have it. And then 3, RS3. So when you freeze water, the molecules take on an orderly configuration. And so some things, when they cool, they don't change their chemistry, but they change their molecular structure. And in this case, we call that retrogranulation. So to a small extent, that can happen in rice, especially glutinous rice like sushi rice. To a much larger extent, that'll occur in white potatoes, solanaceae potatoes. And that's an additional level of RS. And the effect that has on phase 2 is primarily through the formation of short-chain fatty acids, especially acetate. So it's stuff that it still blows me away, but we all know that when we keep our blood glucose stable, we're healthier than if we don't. And the most extreme medical condition of poor blood sugar is a thing called glycogen storage disease. And there's a spectrum of this disorder, but in some versions of it, it's so severe that, if a kid is not fed in 90 minutes, they can go into a coma.
Right.
Wow.
They have no ability to store and break down glycogen effectively. And back in the 80s, researchers thought about this condition and thought about carbohydrate metabolism. And carbs, if they're simple or complex, there's different ways they're categorized. And some are just, small units like the mono, di, or trisaccharides. And then others are long chains, like many types of complex carbohydrate. But there's also those that are highly branched. And it turns out that our enzymes can grab onto a chain and snap off links pretty quickly. But it takes us time to move from one branch to another branch. So we can't really do that in our small intestine. And foods that are high in highly branched carbohydrate, they require breakdown by the colon flora. So the colon flora gets fed first, and we get about half of that. Typical carbohydrate, we're getting 4.5 calories per gram or so, and resistant starch we're ending up with about 2. But because this comes from the colon flora, it's taking us many hours to even start on that, and there's no insulin requirement. And the kids with glycogen storage disease, the first clinical test they did, they would see between 6 to 7 hours of stable blood sugar. So it was like life-changing for these people. They got to sleep through the night for the first time ever.
Yeah.
And now we see that people without that defect can have 7 to 9 hours of just steady, even blood sugar with even small amounts of resistant starch.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this was, it's interesting to see all of these different worlds come together. But so this is something that I've tinkered with in the past for endurance. So like there was a product out there called Generation UCAN, which I think is I'm pretty sure they developed it to treat some level of glycogen storage disease. And then it got sort of co-opted by the endurance crowd who was trying to, maintain healthy levels, or I should say performance levels of blood sugar without the resulting insulin spikes, and that would shut off access to stored body fat. Right. So, go ahead.
Yeah, there was a group in the UK that had a modified RS product, which they utilized. And the funny thing is that you may know better about this than I do. There's also concerns in that community about that, because the idea about absorption being so delayed. I mentioned you may not get it for 4 to 6 hours.
Yeah.
So I guess if there were windows of time in which you want fuel to start coming in that delayed, it could be useful. But for quicker access, then that could be a problem.
Yeah, and it's funny that you bring that up, because that's exactly, I think, what may have killed that product. I mean, it's still available, but for a lot of folks, it was the timing and the preparation and all of this stuff that went into it, which for a community that's used to eating, the old sort of conventional wisdom was, you eat 800 grams of spaghetti, the night before a race and all of this kind of stuff, to plan ahead, an hour to 3 hours before they drink one of these things was just impossible to manage.
Right.
But yeah, so that's super interesting. So in that context, something like this, that's a resistant starch from, whatever format or formula you're going to introduce it. So if folks they're trying to manage their blood sugar in a way that sort of, am I saying this correctly, in that it would sort of give their liver a break to some degree to have this other carbohydrate source that's fundamentally absorbed, absent the insulin response and all of this kind of stuff.
It does give it a break, and we can go a little deeper on that too. So what's going on with fatty liver? Your liver's storing fuel as glycogen and as triglyceride, and glycogen is just compacted, stacked up glucose. There's nothing else that makes it. Triglyceride is any leftovers of fuel, any oxaloacetate. So you can have spare carbohydrate, you can have fructose from that, or glucose, or others. You can also have any fats or lipids. You can have ketones. They can all make triglycerides. Even alcohol can make triglycerides. So you can make them out of anything. And glycogen yields a lot of energy for a little while. Triglycerides yield a ton of energy for a long, long time. But the pitfall is you need you need glycogen to burn triglycerides. It's beta oxidation. A lot of folks think about ketosis as what happens when we're burning fat. And it's really the exact opposite. It's when the body is not able to run beta oxidation and burn fat that we convert fat into ketones. But they're just another fuel type, and the liver can't use that fuel type. So if there's a lot of them present, they have to go elsewhere and be remade into triglycerides. But what's happening in this whole fatty liver condition is that there's so much triglyceride that you can look at the cells under a micrograph, and the triglyceride is just squeezing the whole rest of the cell. So the DNA, which has the nucleus, the mitochondria, they're all compressed. And then the glycogen storage vesicles are compressed. So these cells have reached a state where they've got so much triglyceride, they've lost their ability to store glycogen. And now they've lost their ability to break down triglyceride. So because of all that, the goal is to break down the triglyceride store while you're restoring the glycogen. And the trick with that is if you just eat nothing or eat a lot less, you may break down those stores, but you won't improve those ratios. So the big perk about resistant starch is that you've got this steady, gentle amount of glucose that lets your liver have a chance to replenish glycogen while you're in an energy deficit, and you can tap into the triglycerides.
And this is why I wanted to have you on the podcast, because when I was reading this, it made so much sense.
Well, and it may seem, our listenership is pretty geeky on this kind of stuff. So I'm sure there's a lot of people who are like, aha, this is what's going on. But, I think, unfortunately, as you were saying, the people, and especially people who are somewhere in their life story of seeking help with nutrition and stuff, right? They're generally more educated about these things. They read on it. They're consuming the content that's being produced all the time when it comes to, whatever this optimized diet is for them. But as we're getting into here, there's levels of complexity that can very easily be misconstrued. Like what you just said about ketones, I think would probably turn a lot of people on their ear, because all they've heard all of this time is, well, yeah, I'm taking these. Well, unfortunately, exogenous ketones, I think, have started to kind of fade away, but I'm taking these exogenous ketones in order to burn body fat. So the more of these things I drink, the more fat I burn. And it's just clearly not the case, right?
No, it's another version of fuel. Yeah. It's a funny thing when your body's at a negative energy state, there often is a small amount of metabolic ketosis. Your body can, you can be on like back on the rice diet with Dr. Kempner. His diet was all white rice and sugar, and it was a caloric deficit, and people made some ketones.
Right.
But people confuse cause and effect in those cases. They think that if there's ketones circulating with a caloric deficit, that the ketones caused the caloric deficit or caused the body to break down the stores. But you can have ketones without there being a deficit, and in those cases, there's no breakdown of tissue. You can gain weight from ketones just like anything else.
Right. And it's interesting because the Keto Gains guys, I don't know if you know Louis Villaseñor and that crowd, but they sort of cracked open a lot of this stuff certainly in the paleo keto sphere. They came in and they're fundamentally bodybuilders who use a quote unquote ketogenic diet to put on mass without a tremendous amount of body fat. And when they sort of broke onto the set in the greater kind of paleo primal keto community, it was shock and awe, because they were talking about eating levels of protein that a normal bodybuilder would eat, upwards of, 0.6 to 1 gram per pound of lean mass kind of protein, which was, in the past, just a total taboo for the keto crowd.
Right.
Yet here they are producing similar levels of blood ketones and all of this stuff. And now it's morphed into these guys eating this much protein, plus they're eating maybe 150 grams of carbohydrate a day, depending on how hard they're training. And they're still seeing the same ketone numbers as, people are shooting for. So clearly there's more to the story.
Well, there is. So ketones in the blood, and then and glucose in the blood, and triglycerides in the blood, they only build up above normal physiologic parameters when the system can't use them. So it's just like, they're like, if an airport has no more room for planes, they'll keep the planes up in the pattern. When your liver has no capacity to use fuel, insulin resistance is an intentional safety mechanism. Your body makes the cells less permeable to glucose as a way to keep glucose out in the blood, which it's not good to have high amounts of glucose or ketones or triglycerides in the blood, but it's better there than to have them get stuffed inside the cell and then kill the cells from free radical damage.
So interesting. So what if someone couldn't or didn't want to do the full reset? What kinds of things could they do to start making an impact on the health of their liver?
Easy things are just lowering the amount of burdens and stress on the liver. And if there are problems with that, one of the biggest drivers is alcohol. It's still a substrate of oxaloacetate like the others are, but it's the strongest thing that depletes glycogen. So it's the easy thing that leads to fatty liver. And the funny thing is that, so you mentioned the non-alcoholic fatty liver, which is a valid distinction, but alcoholic fatty liver is not defining, the alcoholic part is not meaning that someone's an alcoholic. It doesn't mean they abuse alcohol. It means they consume even a small amount of it. And then that's thought to be the larger driver of the fat buildup than the food is. And that's like 10 to 15 grams a day. So like a drink or so is all that it takes to put someone in the category of alcoholic fatty liver.
Interesting. Yeah, you would think that it would directly correlate with someone abusing alcohol, so to speak.
And so is that...
it's a funny thing.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
If
it's an interesting aside, the idea about health benefits of alcohol in general haven't really panned out. We used to think that those that consumed some had less cardiovascular death than those that consumed none. And it turned out it was an artifact of the numbers. So people that don't consume alcohol, there's those that just choose not to, and there's those that medically are advised against it because of their medication, their past history, perhaps alcohol abuse. And the people that are medically advised not to drink alcohol, you can imagine they've had some health challenges. And so that group has a higher mortality rate for other reasons. But once you pull them out and you compare those that don't drink by choice against those that drink a little bit by choice, then there's no more health benefit to that little bit of alcohol.
So interesting. And, one of the other things you mentioned in the book that could help support the liver or at least decrease the toxic load is not wearing shoes in the house. And this one really caught my attention because, obviously you go to some people's houses and they don't wear shoes, and then others, it's no big deal. I'd really love for you to just hover on that for a moment. What kind of impact does wearing shoes in the house have on your liver?
It's a funny thing. We think a lot about organic foods and things like that. But the biggest source of environmental toxicants, the biggest quantity we consume comes in our body from the air, bigger than any other source by far. And the largest variable that affects our indoor air quality is just things that we track in from the world around us. I've seen some time-lapse films that were done in which they would have radioactive isotopes on people's shoes, things that were harmless, but they would phosphoresce, they would glow. And someone would walk in with like just microscopic amounts of these things on their shoes. And so for the first few hours, you could see footprints when they would phosphoresce. But then over the course of the next, day, everything in the house would light up. All the surfaces, the plates, all the carpets, the bedding, everywhere. The stuff goes everywhere. And so that's our biggest exposure to lead, and it was one of the biggest indoor contaminants. It's just from our shoes. We bring it in and it goes all throughout our home in a matter of a short period of time. Pesticides, petroleum products, plastic byproducts, they do that as well.
Wow. You don't hear that very
Interesting.
often, right? I mean, everybody's like super concerned about putting food in Tupperware, but then
Right?
they slog around outside and come
We're
back
buying
in.
organic.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because
It pales in comparison.
wow, that's interesting. Yeah, because we think about it, obviously living in the city as well. I mean, I just think what's on our streets out there is it's not a pretty thing.
Well, the time-lapse films, they show you that what's on the streets is on your plates and on your kitchen counters in no time. And
Mm.
that's a freaky way to think about it.
Wow,
And
it's interesting because I know that there was a study and I've never actually read the specific study, so there could be all sorts of confounding things in there, but they had talked about a shortening of people's lifespan who live near a freeway. And so they talked about all sorts of reasons why it might be noise pollution and just, overall, uh, what else is going on. If you're living right next to a freeway, you're probably in
Socioeconomic
yeah,
status, yeah.
exactly. And all of that. But God, if you just think about what's coming off of all of those buses and trucks and cars that are driving, the rubber that's, making it up in the air and blowing over and landing around your home and eventually making it inside, like what a trip.
Yeah.
so interesting. And what about using, some kind of air filter? Does it make an impact, or is that just kind of,
Marketing.
just giving you more peace of mind than actual results?
They can sure help, and
Mhm.
they're more important if you have less control over like building materials, like based upon the paint that's used or what kind of carpet
Mhm.
was put in, how recently. So if those things are more questionable, then filters can help to compensate for that to some degree. Then there's the filters in the central heating and cooling. And
Mm-hmm.
those are great things to swap out at least every other month, and also get the ones that are thicker and pleated that you can't just like see right through, and to keep the
Right.
particulates lower.
Right.
Interesting.
So this is something this is probably going to be a little bit of a deviation, but since we're talking about air quality, it's something that comes up. I mean, quite a bit in the moister, kind of more damp climates where people start talking about indoor mold. And I mean, obviously, black mold had its day in the sun, a number of years ago, and the sort of detriments and side effects and stuff that can come from that. But is this something, when we're talking about this air quality, I mean, is it differentiating between the chemicals and these toxins? Or, I mean, are we kind of talking about a wholesale reduction or sanitization, so to speak, of your indoor air quality that we'd be looking for?
Yeah, they're all relevant, and it's a good point. And funny thing about mold, I'm in the desert Southwest, and when we have mold, we have harsh mold because it is dry. So drier areas can have dangerous versions of mold because they have to be more aggressive. But one common misconception about mold is it's often thought of as a toxicant or thought of as an infectious agent. And there's some pretty rare cases where someone is in ICU and their immune system is shut off to where mold can act as an infection. Other than that, it does not. It also does not act as a toxicant. But what is rather distinct about it is that it's a potentiating allergen. And what I mean by that is once you've got to some threshold to where you're getting allergic responses from it, it takes very little to keep that going. So if someone's gotten susceptible because they're exposed to a lot of mold, I'm just going to make up numbers. They had, 100 parts per million in their air and they got reactive because of that, they may be set off in the future by only 2 parts per million in the air. So that's what's different about mold versus like cat dander or whatnot, is that it's a potentiating allergen, but it's an allergen and it can be a harsh one, and people may have it and not be aware of it.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I suppose that would be exacerbated by some underlying immune system, malfunction, for lack of a better term, anyway. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if people out there are listening and they want to do one thing today to start to improve the health of their liver, what's that one thing that they can activate on right away?
Simplest thing I would think about is increasing the amount of fibers, not the quantity, but the amount of fibers that they're consuming in their diet.
Mm.
So consuming a larger range of food categories. Fiber is thought of as a thing, but it's really a big category. There's like 17 different kinds of fiber we can get in the diet.
Interesting. And why would that be the main thing that you would recommend?
Well, it's a starting place because what's happening is that the waste that the liver is eliminating first head to the intestinal tract, and if the colon has a diverse enough range of flora, then a lot of those wastes can be bound up and packaged and leave in the stool. But in a lack of colon diversity, a lot of those same wastes, they deconjugate, they come back in the bloodstream. Your colon is absorbing electrolytes and fluid. And if a lot of wastes are not tightly chemically bonded, they'll come back into the bloodstream as well. And they then hit the liver again. So you wouldn't need a high burden of toxins to harm your liver if there's this thing going on. It's called enterohepatic recirculation. So if you're getting dosed over and over again from the same stuff, it doesn't take a lot of stuff to be harmful. So the first thing is just to keep things from coming back in again.
Wow.
Really interesting. Part of the book, we come from more of a paleo background, and, part of the book was making the point about having that diversity of fiber and sort of making an argument for incorporating more legumes and some of the grains for this specific subject. And it really got me thinking because, a lot of folks do eliminate these things and then they eliminate their ability to tolerate them. So maybe you could just speak to that really quick before we wrap up about, some of the dangers of eliminating foods and how that impacts your ability to then reintroduce them.
It's a funny thing. There's been more data on this, more so in those that have been extremely low carb, is that they often will just have less of a capacity to tolerate a broad range of foods. And as an extreme example, to make a point, you can imagine if someone were raw food vegan for 5 years and they went to a all-you-can-eat barbecue and had like plates and plates of barbecue pork, they'd probably have a bellyache,
Right,
But that would not be diagnostic of a pork intolerance. That would just be a bad idea,
Right.
And I've seen a lot of people to where they'll look at various symptoms and they'll ascribe symptoms to recently eaten foods, and then they'll keep cutting out more and more foods from their diet. And they'll reach a point at where the intestinal tract gets lazy. You start to lack more diversity and you lack the formation of a lot of enzymes, and you legitimately get more intolerant of more foods, and you can get backed into a corner that way. If someone has tried to eat legumes and they get reactive to that, they'll often think, oh, I just can't digest these. Like, well, right now that's tough. But there's been data saying that if you re-inoculate, if you do like a tablespoon a day for about 2 weeks, that's often small enough not to cause any dramatic symptoms, but it's enough to help your body break down that trisaccharide that's unique to beans again, and then start regaining more of the flora back.
Right. And then, of course, the value to that is, again, a more diverse fiber that is going to help with this, the shuttling out of toxins, so to speak.
There was a pretty dramatic paper showing that they looked at the impact that food categories have on total mortality risk. And then they also quantified that. And the one food category that had the biggest effect on mortality risk gram per gram was legumes. And it even trumped leafy green vegetables. It was like per gram, it was like 4 times the effect of green vegetables on affecting mortality risk. So yeah, it's great to have a range of foods.
Interesting. I really hope people listen to that piece, because I think that, especially like you said, oftentimes folks will just start eliminating more and more foods, and soon you're backed into a corner and you really don't have access to that diversity. So I hope people really take that to heart.
You can think about it like exercise. If you got a sore arm, if you do nothing, it won't hurt.
Right.
But what's the end result with that?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us. This is amazing. And, we get a lot of books from publishers, and I devoured this one in probably 2 days, which
That's awesome.
Which is, it says something about the book.
Sure, yeah.
If you knew me better, you would know that says something, because I'm pretty good at skimming books and getting the gist of it, but I really did devour it. And it really did get me thinking, especially about that last piece of reintroducing some of the foods that, folks tend to eliminate. And I hope that folks will check it out. It's called the Metabolism Reset Diet. Where can folks find it, Dr. Christianson?
Boy, easy thing. If you're blessed enough to have an independent bookstore that's still surviving in your community, please show them some love.
Yes.
They'll have it.
I love that. Yes.
But all the places you normally get books will have it.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. And then where could they find out more about you? I know I've recently started following you on Instagram. It sounds like you're doing some interesting retreats for folks who need help with their thyroid, and some really interesting stuff.
The retreats are a blast. We're doing one of those in April. We take a small group out, and we've got a retreat center. It's also our home. We're in the middle of the Sonora Mountain Preserves, and it's beautiful. And we just go really deep in everyone's story and map out their path back to health again. So those are a lot of fun. My hub is drchristianson.com, and blogs, videos, that's the biggest focus. I just try to figure out, what are people struggling with that's related to their hormones, and what are the solutions that they may not find elsewhere.
Awesome. Well, there are so many people, especially with the baby boomer generation getting older. And we see this in our coaching business all the time, that folks are really struggling with some of these pieces. So it's amazing that you're offering that support and that in-person relationship, which is really important. Awesome. So thank you so much for being with us. The book, again, is the Metabolism Reset Diet, and we hope to hear from you in the future. This has been really awesome, and I'm going to do the diet. We're going to Peru in a couple of weeks, and we'll be traveling for a bit, but I really do want to try it because I'm very interested in seeing the cause and effect of this whole thing and how it can increase, my metabolic flexibility, as you'd say.
It's been a blast having you guys. Yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hey, folks, we hope you enjoyed that podcast. We certainly did. We hope you took some notes and that this one got you thinking, because it really got us thinking. And this is something that I personally am really interested in doing the reset. And we're getting ready to travel to Peru and New Zealand. In fact, while this podcast goes up, we may, in fact, be in Peru.
Yeah, we'll be in Peru.
We'll be in Peru. We're in Peru right now. It's happening. So, a reset on, while you're hiking to Machu Picchu, maybe not a good idea. But when we get back, I really do want to dig into this. So I'm sure we'll be sharing more about this over the coming months. And if you guys have any questions or want to get involved in that process at all, reach out to us at info@bethewellness.com, because, we're always tinkering with ourselves, and it's fun to bring some of you along for the ride if you're willing to go.
Yeah. If you're game, we're game.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've enjoyed the podcast, of course, we love for you to leave a 5-star review, share the episode, especially this episode. There's some awesome nuggets of wisdom in here. And, if anyone out there is struggling with some of the things we talked about today, this could make the difference for them. So share the podcast, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review, subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we don't want to miss you, and we hope you don't want to miss us.
That's true.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week. Bye.
Bye.